Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Public Library, just a little desert outpost where we talk about big ideas. And we're pleased to have you with us today. How many of you were here yesterday? Whoa, a lot of returns, Penny. You have followers. We always have this room completely packed for Penny Rivin. And in 2013, I'm thinking it was back in May or June of 2013, Penny was invited by my comrade in arms, Susan Cook, who handles all of our programming, really designs a lot of what you see in this great booklet. We just ordered 2,000 more of these. We had 3,000 printed and ran out of them. So Susan Cook and I were scheming, and Penny was kind enough to join us, and that's when we began to talk about this series. So this is year 4. We love Penny, we love her mind and her intelligence and her connection with all of you who are thinking people, who are aware of what's going on in this wild world and wild ride that we're in right now. But this program I happen to personally sponsor, but there are opportunities for other programs that we do each year. And you'll see in this booklet, if you have one, or just give us probably till the end of the week, there'll be 2,000 more to come in and pick up. There are programs that you can sponsor too. And we do a lot of active programming here, courtesy of the Library Foundation. And that board just met about 15 minutes ago in the room across the hall, coming up with some good ideas as usual. And they're the fundraising part of this library. So we know we're well funded by the city, and that brings to mind a very important citizen who is with us today, and that's Mayor Ted Weil. Ted? Ted is 24/7 your mayor, loves the city, brings such a mind to it, and good care too. So don't hesitate to call him anytime. It's just, I don't know why that came out, Ted. I have no idea why I said that. But he does welcome your calls, but sometimes daytime would be better. So without further ado, please welcome again, second time, and for the second in this series, Penny Rivin.
Thank you for coming back if you were here yesterday, and thank you for coming today if this is your first time. I am still fighting a little bit of laryngitis, so I'm, again, not going to take any questions at the end, but I think the talk is long enough and you will have been seated long enough that you probably would be ready to go. But I'm going to talk about homegrown terrorists, homegrown terrorism. And as I address this topic today, when I talk about homegrown terrorists, I'm talking about Islamic radicals, because there are others. But today, for our purposes, I'm referring to the Muslim extremists. And someone said yesterday, after it was over, the quotes I used to lighten it up a little bit before we got started on the use of English language and when insults had class, that I only quoted men. And they wanted to know if there were any women that I could bring into this. So I found a couple. But as a group, we don't really say that many things that are insults publicly. I'm standing up for women on this one. But I did find a few, and I think some of you are familiar with the woman Dorothy Parker. She was part of the Algonquin Hotel group, and I think she was the only woman in it. And she had a very sharp wit. She was a writer for the New Yorker and for Vogue and for many of the New York magazines. And she certainly had her competitors and rivals in the New York society. And there was one woman she didn't like very much at all. The woman's name was Minnie. And someone once asked Dorothy Parker about Minnie, what she thought of her, or didn't Minnie look lovely the night before or something? And Dorothy Parker said, well, I don't want to say that Minnie's old and worn out, but I think Minnie should make sure she is nowhere near the curb on trash day. Ooh. Thing. So there was a time when you could be creative. Also, there was a message from an older man to a younger man. The younger man was having a big problem with girlfriends and with women. And the older man said to the younger man, "Do not try to understand women. Women understand women, and they hate each other." I don't think that's true, but I thought it was funny. And then this was heard in a confessional. A woman goes into the confessional and she says to the priest, "Bless me, Father. Last night I killed a politician." And the priest said, "My daughter, I'm here to listen to your sins, not discuss your community service." All right, well, I like to remind audiences of an old Jewish saying that the world stands on prayer, study, and good works. Your faith and religion are demonstrated by how you act, not by just what you believe. And we're going to take a look at homegrown terrorists today. And I think, again, as I said yesterday, this quote by Friedrich Nietzsche is pertinent. Whoever lives for the sake of combating an enemy has a vested interest in keeping that enemy alive. And I want to remind you of an old Chinese curse. But first, I want to remind you to turn your cell phones off. But let me remind you of the old Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Well, before 9/11, a terrorist was a foreigner. Today, most of the terror attacks in the United States since 9/11 are carried out by American citizens or legal residents. This is the new normal, the homegrown terrorist. I'm reminded of the warning from Saddam Hussein as he spoke to a CIA interrogator. Saddam Hussein said, "You Americans are going to fail over here. You are not going to find it so easy to govern us. You Americans are going to fail because you do not know our language. You know nothing of our history. You're ignorant of our religion. And you do not understand the Arab mind." And I'll go back like I did yesterday in a little bit of a reverse to quote one of the former prime ministers of Israel, Ariel Sharon. "The view from there is not the same as the view from here." And so I try to always educate audiences, bring you a very data researched talk about the way things are, not the way we wish they were. But that doesn't mean that things can't be the way we would like them to be in the future, as long as you know what's going on. And you're behind the times if you keep thinking of terrorists as killers in some faraway place who are planning a holy war against us, because the new normal is a homegrown terrorist. There's a new paradigm for terrorism, the individual homegrown terrorist. And I'm convinced that terrorism is arguably going to be the defining factor of the entire 21st century. And more, it's going to be homegrown terrorists making the headlines, attacking governments, destroying private businesses, and terrifying ordinary citizens. The homegrown terrorist is becoming a serious threat to peace and security and stability throughout the Western world. But what does all this even mean? Exactly who and what is threatened? How are we threatened? By whom? And why? And most important, what can be done about it? How can we at least limit the impact of homegrown terrorism? Well, clearly, we are strategically challenged when confronting homegrown terrorists and the ease with which these terrorists can access the internet, use the social media, and obtain high-tech assault weapons. Terrorism itself is very hard to define. The essence of terrorism, some would say the definition of terrorism, is that terrorism is a means to achieve certain goals using violence and fear in order to influence and bring about a new world order. So I'm going to examine 3 areas of homegrown terrorism. First, who and where are the homegrown terrorists? Second, the common denominators. And third, effective responses. So, the why somebody, usually a male, decides to kill is complicated. But here's the general profile of a homegrown terrorist and the difficulties law enforcement faces in identifying and apprehending them. Homegrown terrorists are diverse by agendas, by objectives, by culture, by race, and by traditions. Homegrown terrorists rarely attract attention ahead of time. Homegrown terrorists live among ordinary Americans because they are ordinary Americans. Many homegrown terrorists are Western American educated and fairly stable financially. Though they differ here and there with respect to their backgrounds and ethnicity, all homegrown terrorists are connected by their commitment to radical Islamic teachings. Most of these homegrown terrorists are willing, if not eager, to become martyrs, that is, suicide bombers. So, is there a typical pattern that explains why an individual American citizen would become a jihadi, a holy warrior? Well, the answer is no. Because the more you look at individual cases, the more individual these cases become. But generally speaking, a homegrown terrorist is about 29 years old, 1/3 is married, and 1/3 has children. All of our homegrown terrorists were educated as normal Americans, and very few had discernible mental problems. So what made them terrorists? Well, maybe it was a personal disappointment, a deep-seated grudge, possibly a desire for recognition. Maybe these individuals were desperate to belong to something, or they were seeking a cause. And no matter which homegrown terrorist we identify, there is, in my opinion, there is no such thing as a lone wolf terrorist, because someone else knows something. Even the homegrown terrorist has to coordinate things, and they might or might not involve a teamwork. A terrorist attack requires preparation, weapons, and dedication, and of course, a reliable source of money. Before an attack, homegrown terrorists need to be familiar with the movements and placement of the security forces, the cameras, and the videos. Sometimes a driver and a photographer are involved. And remember, terrorism is at the core theater. In addition to killing people, a terrorist's main objective is to have a lot of people watching and a lot of people very afraid. So let's take a look at the San Bernardino attackers. They were a married 27-year-old and 28-year-old couple. They had a baby. The guy earned over $70,000 a year. So why did they turn to violence and kill 14 people arbitrarily? That's the big mystery. Now, you could explain it by saying they were influenced by Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Taliban ideology, or that they objected to American foreign policy. Well, this is all true. But come on, a lot of people are familiar with radical Islamic teachings, and a lot of people object to American foreign policy, but they don't abandon their baby or arbitrarily kill 14 people attending an office Christmas party. As difficult as it is to identify who is a terrorist, at the end of the day, the why someone chooses to become a jihadi remains fundamentally inexplicable. A major difficulty in identifying and combating homegrown terrorism is the internet. And the internet is essentially an American invention. Today, American English is the preferred language throughout the social media. Most of the radical Islamic teachings on the internet are not in Arabic anymore. The internet is the driver for radicalization. The internet acts as an enabler by giving an aspiring homegrown terrorist a forum by which he or she can share information and targets and weapons with other would-be terrorists. Let's take a look at an American, Samir Khan, K-H-A-N. Samir Khan, an American kid. He grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Khan founded the first English-language jihadi website and webzine. Webzine is what you call a magazine online. So Samir Khan founds the first English-language jihadi website and webzine. He calls it Inspire. You can Google Inspire and pull it up if you want to take a look. Inspire is a snazzy, well-laid-out webzine with good graphics and a little bit of humor, and is accessible to anybody. One of Inspire's most viewed shows has been How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. It even had a little jingle. This site has been effectively shut down, but it was running up until about a year ago. And there are others that are very similar to this. Inspire has turned up in almost every terror case in the United States, including the Boston Marathon case, where the brothers used bomb recipes they derived online from Inspire. This is really revolutionary because anybody, anywhere in the world now has access to a lot of English language material that was previously available only in Arabic on password-protected sites. Now it's open. Inspire, the webzine, calls for Western jihadis to stockpile weapons as they go along, learn the methods of war, and work to bring about a new world order, a new normal for the 21st century. And these various websites have developed dozens of front groups inside the U.S. I think the most noted one, the most perhaps powerful one, is a Muslim organization which is huge and does many, many things. But one of the things it does is provide legal coverage for any of these activities online. And the group is called CAIR, C-A-I-R, the Council on American Islamic Relations. The goal of the homegrown terrorist is not to reach an accommodation with the West or the Americans, but rather to destroy it, destroy us. The FBI estimates that there are more than 18,000 websites and web forums that support terrorist activities. 18,000 websites and web forums that support terrorist activities, with 10,000 actively maintained websites, and 80% of these are based on U.S. servers. And authorities appear to be at a loss in dealing with this new type of internet crime, this new type of internet savvy enemy, the homegrown radical Muslim terrorist, because the legal issues of American privacy and free speech always muddy the waters. In the past, America was well equipped to knock out a normal enemy because the enemy was a conventional, identifiable, geographically located enemy and attacked us using planes, tanks, and ships. But don't lose sight of the fact that homegrown terrorism is not new. I think many of us remember the 1995 Oklahoma City bombings, but the circumstances today are different. In the 21st century, we find that we're dealing with religious fanatics, and these religious fanatics do not fear death. Perhaps surprisingly, for the most part of today's homegrown terrorists, for many of us, they're not young hotheads. Many of these terrorists are or have been married, they have children, and they are very far from the stereotype of a lone, angry, James Dean, rebel without a cause kind of teenager. Now, these types of individuals certainly do exist, but in the United States, terrorism is appealing to a very wide range of people, male and female, from teenagers to people well over their 60s. But let's keep this in perspective. In the 16 years since 9/11, homegrown terrorists have killed relatively few people inside of the United States. Just to refresh your memory, there were only 3 deaths from the Boston Marathon bombings, 14 deaths in San Bernardino killings, 13 deaths in the Fort Hood shootings, and 49 people were killed in the Orlando shooting. The attack in Orlando, Florida, was the deadliest terrorist attack in the United States since 9/11, and it was the deadliest mass shooting in American history. And low though these numbers are in terms of death, each death is a tragedy. However, these homegrown attacks so far are not national catastrophes in the same way 9/11 was. While the United States has seen a series of deadly attacks by homegrown terrorists who were inspired by radical Islam, the United States, in fact, remains a hard target, not a soft target for foreign terrorists. Somebody once asked me, well, what would be a soft target country? Well, Greece, Mexico, perhaps Venezuela. There would be others, but the United States is a very hard target for foreign terrorists. And the fact that we are a hard target for homegrown terrorists is a direct result of America's layered set of defenses. These layered defenses in the United States include tips from local Muslim communities, far more than they've ever been given credit for, calls from members of the public, if you see something, say something, and of course the widespread use of paid informants. New York City is probably the best at this. But these are our layered defenses, and so far they have served us very well. Now, of course, a deadly attack directed from abroad cannot be ruled out. But it is less likely to happen here in the United States than it is in Europe or the UK or Africa. Look at it this way. Homegrown terrorism is associated with violent acts committed by citizens of their own country or permanent residents against their own people and property within their own country, the United States. There is rarely any direct foreign influence involved. The objective of a homegrown terrorist is to instill fear in a community or a government as a means to achieve a political, religious objective. And at the core, terrorism remains theater. But we have to be careful, and there is cause for concern. There's cause for concern because since 2011, roughly 1/4 of the homegrown terrorist plots, that is 25% of the homegrown terrorist plots, do have suspected ties to major international terrorist groups. And disturbingly, there is evidence of an increasing number of Americans holding high-level operational positions in some of the deadliest international terrorist groups. Michael Hayden, former director of the CIA, calls homegrown terrorism the most serious threat we face because homegrown terrorists have the advantage. The homegrown terrorists encounter fewer logistical problems. They're familiar with American English. They are American. They know the American people very well. They know the American customs. And all of these things make our homegrown terrorists very valuable assets to any international terrorist organization down the road. Michael Hayden, former head of the CIA, frames the problem like this. Just how does a democracy like ours protect the rights and privacy of the American people and at the same time create a security structure that will curtail these very rights and privacies of the American people? And Hayden calls this a devil of a problem because he said in creating such a security system, law enforcement always runs the risk of infringing on basic American rights. Another hurdle is that while homegrown terrorism is inexpensive to carry out, protecting against homegrown terrorism is very expensive. And on top of all this, our prison systems remain a concern because U.S. prisons, any prisons, but our prisons are fertile places for radicalization and jihadi recruiting. Nearly 36, a little more than 36 ex-convicts from American prisons were arrested after they attended training camps in Yemen, and they are believed to have been radicalized while they were serving time in U.S. prisons. Experts say that while some homegrown terrorists do achieve their objectives, the vast majority of individual terrorist operators fail in their plots because of poor training, they're sloppy, they didn't plan well enough. And there's always this question underneath all of that of whether these individuals were really Muslim radicals or just suffering from other problems. There's the American convert, Abdul Hakim Muhammad. His birth name was Carlos Bledsoe. And Bledsoe killed a U.S. military recruiter in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he wounded another bystander. And when he was arrested, he said he had a whole lot of targets throughout the United States. But the investigators found no evidence of this, and Bledsoe's own father described his son as completely unable to process reality and that he had been, quote, off his rocker for years. Bledsoe was charged with capital murder, not terrorism, and he pleaded guilty and was found guilty. The American military psychiatrist Major Nidal Hassan, charged in the 2009 Fort Hood shooting, came to the attention of his superiors years earlier, way before the shootings, and his superiors documented their concerns about his suspected radicalization. But in the United States, you cannot arrest someone for something they might do. And so these warnings went unaddressed. And when the major did the shooting in 2009, The Defense Department initially classified these shootings as workplace violence rather than terrorism. And many Americans were incensed by this and said, how can you call it workplace violence when clearly it was a terrorist attack, which it was. But many of you who are involved in law enforcement or involved with the law know that you have to be very careful what the charge is because you have to be able to prove it or it will be dropped. And so initially, they could substantiate workplace violence and get this guy. Later, the charges were changed to, subsequently, they were changed to charges of terrorism. He was convicted on terrorism charges and sentenced to death, but any death penalty, any death sentence in the United States automatically goes to appeal. And he's being held in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas right now, awaiting death. And I think his appeal is over, and I think he will be put to death shortly. Then there's a Somali organization, Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab in Arabic means the youth or the young boys. The Somali organization recruited effectively in Minneapolis, St. Paul. But this radicalization and recruitment is not an isolated phenomenon unique to Somali Americans. Rather, what Al-Shabaab was doing merely demonstrates that there is a nascent, sort of a newborn terrorist recruitment infrastructure attempting to take shape inside of the United States. For homegrown terrorists, the goal is singular. It's not to reach an accommodation. The goal is to destroy. And we Americans are going to be forced to make some very important decisions in the coming years, such as, do we want to continue promoting multiculturalism and celebrating the diversity among our communities? Or are we going to start demanding that people who come here adopt American customs and obey our laws? This is a tough one. And there's truth on both sides. Homegrown terrorist authority Peter Bergen, often appears on CNN, has written a book titled The United States of Jihad. Bergen reports on jihadis who were born in the United States or became legal citizens and grew up here, and Bergen discusses how they were radicalized. A recent arrest, I think last year, was of two homegrown hopefuls, homegrown terrorists, were in Kansas City, Missouri. So you'd be surprised. Bergen's book's very interesting, of all these little pockets where you have people attempting to become a homegrown terrorist. And he talks about how were these people radicalized. And Bergen illustrates how the internet and the social media are being used to radicalize and recruit homegrown terrorists. However, I think it's very necessary to relieve any irrational fears about homegrown terrorism. We need to always put things in perspective. Since 9/11, more Americans have been killed by people on the far right who were motivated by anti-abortion beliefs, neo-Nazi sentiments, anti-Semitism, and anti-government fanaticism than have been killed by Islamic radicals so far. And remember, despite all the rhetoric to the contrary, every lethal terrorist attack since 9/11, whether in Fort Hood or Boston or San Bernardino or Orlando, was carried out by American citizens or legal residents, not by foreigners, not by refugees, and not by immigrants. Now, clearly, some of the hysteria about refugees and immigrants coming here to kill us is overblown. But about 10 refugees have been involved in relatively minor jihadi terrorism crimes since 9/11, such as providing material support to a terrorist organization. In some cases, it was writing a check to a charity. In others, it was going on these websites. So there were about 10 refugees, and the three that were arrested, 2 were from Boston and 1 was from Iraq. And that was about 8 years ago. So there have been relatively few involved. but the serious attacks are done so far by Americans. So keep in mind that in reality, for the most part, the jihadis we see in the United States are American citizens or legal American residents, not refugees, not immigrants. Therefore, I want you to bring some rationality to the problem. Terrorism is currently a relatively minor issue, and the United States government has done a good job of keeping Americans safe up to now. Let me offer an example. On 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Today, February 2017, there are 47,000 people on the no-fly list. There's a second list of 1.5 million people who, if they fly into the United States, must go through first and secondary screenings. Now, undoubtedly, up to now, the good news is that the United States has managed the homegrown threat with the help of the American Muslim community, which is not the case in the UK or Europe. Over here in America, we are looking at a very different problem. But there are some hurdles and problems still to overcome. For example, if a parent, an American parent, knows that his or her child is toying with or becoming infatuated with terrorist websites, this parent faces a very difficult choice about what to do. The parent thinks, if I go to the FBI and it turns out that my child has planned to join a terrorist group, the automatic penalty for my child is 15 years, automatically 15 years in a federal prison. And that's without any implication or evidence of potential violence. On the other hand, the parent thinks, if I don't do anything about my child's fascination with radical Islamic teachings, I'm running the risk of my son and daughter suddenly disappearing, becoming a suicide bomber, and he or she is very likely going to end up dead. This is a very tough call for parents. The good news is that there is some understanding of this dilemma for families and communities at the highest levels of the American government, where people recognize that when somebody is being radicalized, it does not necessarily mean that the individual is going to commit violence. In fact, if you are watching the series on Showtime, Homeland, that's their theme, this series, of a homegrown terrorist, or a young man being accused of being a homegrown terrorist, facing a 15-year automatic prison sentence. So this is very timely when we look at a topic like this. Now, homegrown terror experts agree that there needs to be an off-ramp that won't necessarily lead to an automatic 15-year federal prison sentence for a child, because this would encourage families and communities to come forward more often. Under this plan, a parent would be able to inform the FBI without automatically sending their child to a 15-year federal prison. There would be, of course, a short prison sentence and supervised probation if there were no allegations of proof of violence. And in fact, a parent, by doing this, could be saving his or her child's life. But undeniably, this off-ramp approach is in the very early stages at the high levels of our government, and it is fraught with problems, legal and social. Verifiable data on prevented attacks is not readily available. As I said, New York City has the best database, but New York keeps it close to the chest for obvious reasons. And then we always have the pull between law enforcement officers who want to make an arrest and those in the intelligence agencies who want to follow a suspect for a year or two to see if they can catch a bigger fish. This is very complicated. Now, technically, in the Quran, Al-Quran, the Muslim holy book, all Muslims are required to defend Islam and defeat infidels. But it's the radical Muslims who are creating the mayhem and murder. But you have to think about this. There have to be a certain percentage of the more moderate Muslims who are quietly cheering the radicals on. The informants in the Muslim community are essential if we're going to learn about future attacks and homegrown plots. But any informant in the Muslim community who comes forward to our law enforcement is placing themselves and their families in very great risk. However, despite this, FBI officials say there are more members of the Muslim community coming forward right now because when a radical carries out an attack, Muslims say their whole community suffers. And the moderate ones or the peaceful ones say we don't want these bad ones making all of us pay for it. So you are getting, up to now, more and more Muslims turning others in if they suspect them. Now, we are indeed facing a very different approach with President Trump, and we don't know how this is going to play out. It just started. But I think it's interesting, when Hitler was in power, he and the Nazis always tried to cover up their crimes. Today, we're dealing with groups like ISIS and others who provide videos of their beheadings and drownings and immolations, the burnings and the bombings. These terrorist groups are using the social media as a recruitment tool for homegrown terrorists. So we are up against a very different type of killer today. And add to all this that ISIS, more than any other group, including Al-Qaeda and the Al-Qaeda spin-offs, ISIS has found a way to recruit the criminal element, the criminal terrorist, who's willing to conduct jihad for money and has long-standing ties to the drug underworld in Europe and in Latin America. Yes, I'm afraid there will be other terrorist attacks on our soil. But statistically speaking, homegrown terrorism is still, right now, a very minor problem. Experts keep reminding us that we are between 3,000 and 5,000 times more likely to be killed by an angry fellow American with a gun or during road rage than we are to be killed by a Muslim terrorist. And while these terrorists are nasty, don't forget they're also human, and they have and will make mistakes. But before I close, I want to introduce you to someone you don't know, someone you have probably never heard of. He's extremely well known outside of the Western world. He's someone who is very dangerous. His name is Abu Musab al-Suri. Abu Musab al-S-U-R-I. Abu Musab al-Suri. We have Suri on our cell phones. You can remember that name. You can look this guy up. Abu Musab al-Suri. He's Syrian by birth. He holds Spanish citizenship by marriage. And he hasn't been seen in years since Bashar al-Assad released him from a Syrian prison. The Israelis have been chasing him. The Americans have been chasing him. The rumors are he may be one of the ghost prisoners in one of the black sites. Some of the rumors are that he's in one of the black sites off of Guantanamo in Cuba, or maybe he's being held somewhere else. There are rumors that he's on the loose. There are rumors that he is dead. It doesn't matter. His teachings live on. He's not a bad-looking guy, actually. I don't know what he looks like today, but pictures of him from the past. He has, or had, red hair, sort of a pleasant face, and he would not have looked out of place in Ireland in a pub or in Scotland. Abu Musab al-Suri is a brilliant theorist. And before 9/11, he lived in London. His English was impeccable. The media always thought of him and was introduced to him as a journalist. And under the guise of being a journalist, he took many of the foreign press, including Peter Jennings. Remember Peter Jennings of ABC? One time Peter Jennings went to meet and interview Osama bin Laden. Well, this Abu Musab al-Suri, under the guise of being a journalist, took a lot of the foreign press, including Peter Jennings, to meet and interview Osama bin Laden near the borders of Pakistan and Afghanistan. But in reality, Abu Musab al-Suri was something quite different. In reality, al-Suri was running a jihadi training camp, had been doing it for years, and had serious differences of opinion with Osama bin Laden. Al-Suri wrote and published a book on leaderless jihadis, jihadis with no leaders, homegrown terrorists. And al-Suri titled his book, The Call for Global Islamic Resistance. Just what was Abu Musab al-Suri's strategy for these leaderless jihadis, these homegrown terrorists? And how does it fit in with what we see today? Well, al-Suri's basic premise is that terrorists need to stop forming large organizations, because large organizations can be easily detected and destroyed. Al-Suri taught that a terrorist should be homegrown. A terrorist should form very small cells or act alone, because that way governments and militaries could not easily detect them. And as a result of al-Suri's teachings, we no longer see the new formation of large terrorist groups. We're not seeing groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas or Hezbollah. We don't see large groups forming and sending outside terrorists into the United States like what we saw before 9/11. What we do see are citizens in their own countries self-radicalizing at home, in their bedrooms, online. This is the new normal. Albert Einstein may be right to the point. We cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking that we used when we created the problems. But I think there's a better quote from Immanuel Kant. Kant said, "You need to understand that from the crooked timber of humanity, not a straight thing is ever made." Thank you. Thank you very much.